For those of you who like to entitle your messages, today the message is called Whatever It Takes. So whatever it takes for the preaching of the gospel to get out there and to win some for Christ. So it's interesting to me that Paul starts by asserting his rights. So he talks about the power to eat and drink, the power to take a wife, but then he goes on to explain why he doesn't use those rights. So the right to use these gifts it's biblical. It comes purely from the Bible. We see all the way from the Old Testament, and we go on. Paul, he says further, Timothy 5 verse 17, he says that elders should receive double honor. So why doesn't Paul use these rights that he speaks about? And we can go on to one chapter back. It says, be careful, however, that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. Paul knew that in the context and in the time that he was preaching, in the city that he was preaching, that the young people that he was evangelizing, or the young Christians in the young church, he knew that they were carnal. He knew that it would be their inclination to focus on, well, we're giving money to Paul so that he survives. And actually, some of us still struggle with this very concept today, which is why it's so difficult for some of us to give. We see consistently throughout Paul's writing that he talks about winning people to salvation or saving other people to salvation, and he himself wants to be a partaker in this very salvation. What is it going to benefit him if after all the work he does, he himself does not run the race and win the prize at the end? If you actually think about it. So, one question that, in line with the first point, to win some, or to save some rather, is what is Paul trying to save them from? What is the point? What is he saving them from? And essentially, it's what Paul talks about all the time. So he talks about it a lot in Romans. He talks about the wrath of God. That is what his aim is, to save them. I'll read from the slide. It says, since we have now been justified by his blood, how much more shall we be saved from God's wrath through him? Romans 2 verse 5, because of your stubbornness and unrepentant heart, you're storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath and revelation of the righteous judgment of God. So what drives Paul, what motivates Paul, what causes Paul to do whatever it takes is the fear of this, the wrath of God, which is spoken of throughout the scripture. And it's interesting that we often don't think about this a lot. But Bible scholars will tell you that Jesus talked more about the wrath of God, more about hell than he ever talked about the kingdom, more than he ever talked about heaven. Because, that is what God, that's what he came for. That's what he came to save us from. Do we really believe that there is a coming day of judgment? So if we did, we would speak more often about Jesus. We would tell the world more often about Christ. So it's either we don't really believe, or we just don't care. Kind of like, I'm on the boat. If you're not on it, that's up to you. Shame for you. So it's either we don't really believe that God's wrath is coming, which is a problem, or we just don't care about the world. And that is why Paul was so radical and urgent about his message. He was driven by pity for the unsaved. He was driven by pity for the world, for the unrepentant, just as Jesus was. So how many of us can honestly say within ourselves that we are driven by this same urgency? So we're not just talking about whether it be people who are actual ministers or apostles or ordained bishops or elders of churches. How many of us as Christians, because Paul says, do follow me even as I follow Christ. So follow my example, even as I follow the example of Christ. So how many of us live sold out? How many of us actually live radically as Paul did? As I said, it's either we don't believe that the wrath of God is coming, or we just don't care. There's a world out there that is the majority of whom are going to an eternity apart from God. This is the thrust of what Paul is talking about. Living powerfully as the body of Christ, thoroughly in the city or in the world, and yet profoundly not of it. So, Galatians 5 verse 13 says the following. It says, "You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. Rather serve one another humbly in love." And again, Paul's tactic here is love. So it means adapting himself. And so, for example, let's take this. To the Jews I became like a Jew, to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law. So you have to understand the context that he was talking about this, because at the time they were Jews and Gentiles. So he was saying, I'm not under the law. So for example, I'm not bound by eating certain things. I'm not bound by circumcision, for example. I'm not bound by having to make sacrifice for atonement for sin. And though, yet whilst I'm with those people, I observe those practices for the sake of the gospel. Then he says, to those not having the law, I became like one not having the law. Though I'm not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law. And what is Christ's law? The law of Christ is love. It says a Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. A Christian is a perfectly dutiful servant of all, subject to all. These two theses seem to contradict each other. It says love by its very nature is ready to serve and be subject to him who is loved. So what he means is that love by its very nature is willing to do what is necessary to get across the message. And that's what Paul was doing. And it's interesting that Paul uses the same, Jesus Christ himself uses the same tactic. In Philippians 2 he says, "But he made himself of no reputation, and took upon the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross." We're going to pray in response to the sermon. And as you pray, I want you to ask yourself again the following questions. Firstly, do I really believe in the coming wrath of God? And two, if so, am I radically living to reach the lost as Paul did?